Good evening. Welcome to part 2 of Mississippians in the Army of Northern Virginia. I'm Jeff Gambrone. If you have not watched part 1 of Mississippians in the Army of Northern Virginia, I highly recommend that you go back and start with the previous episode because you will really need to see that to get up to speed. In the first episode, we covered everything from the beginning of the war up through the Battle of Malvern Hill in July of 1862 and the end of the 7 Days battles for Richmond, which saw the Union Army withdraw, leaving the Confederate capital safe for the time being. And we're going to just pick up from there. And before the next campaign got underway, the Army of Northern Virginia underwent a reorganization. All of the Mississippi infantry regiments in that army were assigned to General James Longstreet's corps. And this is a picture of General Longstreet from the Library of Congress collections. And the Mississippians who served in his corps were going to see some very hot and heavy action over the coming months. After the beating that the Army of the Potomac had taken during the 7 days, General McClellan was content to remain safely entrenched at Harrison's Landing on the Virginia Peninsula in July and August of 1862. But meanwhile, there was another Union Army that the Army of Northern Virginia was going to have to contend with, and that was the Army under the command of Major General John Pope. The Union High Command eventually ordered McClellan to withdraw from the peninsula and link his forces up with Pope so that they could strike as a combined force. Robert E. Lee very clearly saw this threat and wanted to move on Pope before this junction could be made between the two Union armies. This move brought about the Battle of Second Manassas on August 29th and 30th, 1862. And this illustration, from the Library of Congress collections, is just showing a scene from the Battle of Second Manassas, a line of Union infantry firing at oncoming Confederate infantry. In this battle, Lee split his forces. He struck the Union Army on the second day of the battle with a devastating flank attack that routed the Federals from the field. Casualties among the Mississippi units engaged in this battle were fairly light, about 41 killed and about 295 wounded. And one Mississippi brigade did not take part in this battle, and that was Barksdale's brigade. Barksdale's command had been sent to the area around Harper's Ferry, so they were not available, and they would not be heard from until the Sharpsburg campaign. So they totally missed out on the Battle of Second Manassas. It's one of the very few major battles in the East that Barksdale's brigade was not involved in. And after the Battle of Second Manassas, one Mississippi newspaper in an account of the fighting had this to say. They wrote, "The Battle of Manassas has been fought a second time, a great victory again achieved. The enemy sought to prevent a junction of Longstreet with Jackson by a heavy column at Thoroughfare Gap, but was driven back after a sharp fight. This was on Thursday. They then attacked Jackson at Gainesville on Friday, hoping to crush him before Hill got up, but they were again defeated. Longstreet arrived and the attack was renewed on Saturday at 3 o'clock when a terrific conflict ensued on the old battleground of Manassas, which continued until night, the enemy having been driven in confusion across Bull Run." And that was taken from an article in the Hinds County Gazette, September 10th, 1862. And after the smashing victory at Second Manassas, Lee really wanted to press his advantage by taking the war out of Virginia, and he targeted Maryland. Unfortunately, a copy of his plans fell into McClellan's hands during the course of the Confederate movement into Maryland, and with this information, McClellan moved uncharacteristically fast to intercept Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. So the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia met in battle at Sharpsburg, Maryland on September 17, 1862. Lee's army was very badly outnumbered. He had approximately 45,000 men. McClellan had upwards of 75,000, but unfortunately for the Union Army, McClellan really kind of wasted a lot of his numeral superiority by making piecemeal attacks and not committing all of his strength at once. This allowed Robert E. Lee to concentrate his forces against each Union attack, and the two sides just fought to an extremely bloody draw along the banks of Antietam Creek. The carnage of Sharpsburg was really almost unbelievable in scale. There were about 2,100 Federal troops killed, about 2,000 Confederates killed, approximately 9,000 wounded on each side, and the casualties were just as bad in proportion for the Mississippi units involved. The Mississippi regiments that fought at Sharpsburg suffered casualties of about 852 men killed or wounded. One of the Mississippians who fought at Sharpsburg was C.F. Jones, who served in Company I, the Adams Light Guard of the 16th Mississippi Infantry. He was mortally wounded in the fight and died on October 10th. His obituary in the Natchez Daily Courier had this to say about him, quote, "He was a good soldier, he knew his duty, and always performed it." That's from the Natchez Daily Courier, November 4th, 1862. And I think you could have made that same statement about quite a number of the Mississippians involved in the fighting at Sharpsburg. And after the fighting had ended, Private Edward M. Burris of the 21st Mississippi Infantry walked around the ground where his regiment had fought. This scene shown here is an illustration of the rebel dead in the sunken road at Antietam. It gives you a feeling for just how bloody this battle was. The 21st Mississippi fought in an area known as the West Woods, and when Burris walked over the ground, it really made an impression on him. He wrote home to his family about what he saw in the wake of the battle, and he told his family, quote, "I had an opportunity of going over the battlefield. In fact, we were immediately on one of the very bloodiest parts of it. In no figure of speech, metaphor, or anything but a simple fact to say that there were frequently places where for 50 or 60 yards you could step from one dead Yank to another and walk all over the ground without touching it with your foot. On one little knoll about 25 or 30 yards square, I myself counted 189 dead Yankees, and they were no thicker there than in many other places." It's almost unbelievable that that kind of carnage went on, but it certainly did, and there are plenty of accounts and also the photographic evidence to prove just how bloody this battle was. In fact, it's the single bloodiest day in American history. Now, after the losses that the Army of Northern Virginia suffered at Antietam, Lee had to retreat back into Virginia, really to reorganize and try and build back up his very weakened army. The Yankees really aided in this effort by not making a serious push against the Army of Northern Virginia until mid-November of 1862, when the Army of the Potomac, by this time under the command of General Ambrose Burnside, marched on Fredericksburg, Virginia. And this is a great photograph of Fredericksburg from the Library of Congress collections. Just love this picture because Fredericksburg is a beautiful town, and I just love this image. But Burnside marched on Fredericksburg with an army of about 122,000 men. Unfortunately, he was not able to cross the Rappahannock before Lee was able to concentrate his army on the heights outside of Fredericksburg. In November of 1862, Edward M. Burris of the 21st Mississippi Infantry wrote to his family from Fredericksburg and kind of gave them an update on current events and what was going on in the war in Virginia. And he told his family, quote, "The Yankees occupy the country immediately opposite Fredericksburg, on the other side of the Rappahannock River, their pickets extending right down to the water's edge, ours doing the same on our side, and their cannon commanding every street in Fredericksburg. They had the impudence the other day to send over and demand the surrender of the city, stating that their batteries commanded the entire city and that they could batter it down whenever they pleased. The demand was, of course, refused." And the Federals would find, much to their chagrin, that Fredericksburg was going to be a very tough nut to crack. On December 11th, 1862, the Federals began their assault on Fredericksburg by constructing pontoon bridges to cross the Rappahannock. The assault was opposed by Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, who had men lined up in the buildings along the waterfront, and they put up a very stout defense. They delayed the Union crossing until very late in the day, but once the Federals did manage to cross in force, Barksdale's men began falling back to the heights behind Fredericksburg, and again putting up a very tough defense. The Federals really had to root them out of the buildings and the cellars, and it was some very nasty fighting, block by block, as the Mississippians withdrew in the face of this very large and powerful Federal force. One unidentified Mississippian wrote to the Vicksburg Daily Whig on July 6, 1863, and he gave this account of the opposition that Barksdale's brigade put up to the Federal crossing of the Rappahannock. And he said, "The 17th Regiment of Mississippi Volunteers of Barksdale's brigade was on picket on the riverbank under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fizer, one of the most daring and accomplished commanders from our gallant state. Silently and cautiously he posted his men, and when several of the boats had been put in position and a large crowd of the engineers and pontooniers had collected their own for prosecution of their perilous work, the brave colonel gave the order to fire. The sharp crack of their rifles rang out on the morning air, and the yell of the frightened and dying Yankees told how their shots had taken effect. Away scampered the living Yankees, but they soon returned and removed their dead and dying comrades. At this time, a terrible fire of shell, grape, and canister was opened on the riverbank from the Yankee batteries, which compelled our troops to retire. As soon, however, as the pontooniers recommenced their work, our brave boys again returned and drove them back under the cover of their guns. Thrice was this repeated with like results." On December 13th, Burnside attacked the entrenched Confederates behind the town, and the Union troops were mowed down by waves of Confederate musketry and artillery. The Yankees suffered about 12,000 casualties before the attack was finally called off. Southern casualties were less than 5,000. Losses among most of the Mississippi troops were negligible. And this is one of an illustration from the Library of Congress showing the Union Army putting up their pontoon bridges to cross the Rappahannock and attack Fredericksburg. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Army of Northern Virginia went into winter quarters. They would not see any more significant combat until late April of 1863, when the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, General Joseph Hooker, surprised Lee by flanking the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg and concentrating his men at a crossroads known as Chancellorsville. Hooker had approximately 70,000 men in Lee's rear, having left about 40,000 men at Fredericksburg. Lee only had about 60,000 men in the Army of Northern Virginia to combat this very large host. And shown in here in this illustration, again, this is a Library of Congress image, is a photograph taken by a Union photographer across one of the railroad bridges. And on the far side are Confederate soldiers from Barksdale's brigade. And some recent, over the last few years, there's been a lot of research done on this photo, and a lot of this research indicates that this was the 17th Mississippi Infantry in this image. It's one of my favorite pictures of the war. It's just a great image. You don't see a lot of images of Confederates in the field, but this is one of my favorites. It's just one of the all-time classic photographs of the Civil War. In the Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1st through 4th, 1863, Lee devised a very bold strategy. He left about 10,000 men to hold his front at Fredericksburg. He took the remainder of his army and went to confront Hooker. On May 2nd, Lee divided his army again. He sent Stonewall Jackson with about 28,000 men to make a surprise attack on Hooker's flank. Lee remained in front of Hooker with about 18,000 men. This was a serious gamble, dividing his army yet again in the face of such a large enemy force, but it paid off. Stonewall Jackson was able to smash the Union flank. Hooker had to withdraw his army, battered but still intact, and Lee was able to claim another victory. The cost for this victory, though, was going to be extremely high. Stonewall Jackson was wounded in the fighting accidentally by his own men, and he would eventually die of his wounds, which was a very serious loss for the Army of Northern Virginia. Mississippi losses at Chancellorsville were fairly light, only about 438 men killed or wounded out of a total 13,000 casualties in the Army of Northern Virginia. And this illustration is, again, depicting the fighting at Chancellorsville, and it's from the Library of Congress collections. And this photograph is a modern image of Catherine Furnace on the Chancellorsville battlefield. And the Mississippi Brigade, commanded by General Carnot Posey, who was shown in this inset picture, particularly distinguished themselves at Catherine Furnace. The division commander, Major General Richard H. Anderson, wrote of them in his official report of the battle and said of Posey's brigade, quote, "Where all perform their duty with so much zeal and courage, it is almost impossible to make a distinction. But Brigadier General Posey and his brave, untiring, persevering Mississippians seem to me to deserve special notice. Their steadiness at the furnace on Saturday evening, when pressed by greatly superior numbers, saved our army from great peril, while their chivalrous charge upon the trenches on Sunday contributed largely to the successes of that day." And at this time, Posey's brigade consisted of the 12th Mississippi Infantry, the 16th Mississippi Infantry, the 19th Mississippi Infantry, and the 48th Mississippi Infantry. And they really made a name for themselves during the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Mississippians in the Army of Northern Virginia were some hard fighters. I don't know that you could pick any one brigade that was better than the other. They were all very good combat soldiers. By this stage of the war, they were mostly veterans. They were a tough bunch, and they put up a good scrap in just about every battle they were in. While the main battle was taking place at Chancellorsville, Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade had been left to fight their own private war at Fredericksburg. Left behind to guard the city, this small brigade of Mississippians was attacked on May 3rd by over 25,000 Federals. Fighting like basically demons, the Mississippians repulsed two attacks on Marie's Heights. but were overwhelmed in that third assault that the Federals made. The Mississippians were forced to withdraw very precipitously to avoid being killed or captured, and a lot of Mississippians lost their lives in this fighting retreat. Private William H. Moore of Company I, the Sunflower Guards, 21st Mississippi Infantry, wrote of the fighting at Fredericksburg just a week after the battle. He was writing to his mother, and he gave a very descriptive account of the fighting that took place. He said, "And in less time almost than I can describe it, they had flanked us both right and left. And as they had an overwhelming force of almost 20 to 1 coming down upon us in front, so that they had us almost entirely surrounded, we were compelled to get out the best way we could. We fought as long as we could fight, and as long as there was any use in fighting, and did not budge till we had positive orders to save ourselves best way we could. About one half of our brigade were taken prisoners. The rest of us managed to escape by running the risk of being killed getting away." And this image, again, Library of Congress collection, was taken very shortly after the fighting ended on May 3rd, and the men in this trench that you see dead here are Mississippians of Barksdale's brigade. Behind this stone wall was the entire 18th Mississippi Infantry and 3 companies of the 21st Mississippi Infantry. So these dead that are lying here have to be from one of those 2 regiments. Losses in the 18th and 21st Mississippi were pretty heavy, but their losses were not in vain. After defeating Hooker's main army at Chancellorsville, Lee sent reinforcements back to Fredericksburg, and the Union forces withdrew from the city and returned to their starting point on the opposite side of the Rappahannock. And I do want to mention one of the Mississippians killed in the fighting here at Marie's Heights was Private Frank Ingram from Port Gibson. He was a member of Company I, the Sunflower Guards, 21st Mississippi Infantry, and it's kind of interesting. He was the nephew of Union General George Gordon Meade. His sister, or his mother, was General Meade's sister. She had moved with her husband to Port Gibson long before the war, and she had a number of sons that fought in the Confederate armies, and had at least 2 sons I know of that were killed during the course of the war. But yeah, one of them was Frank Ingram. Now, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Army of Northern Virginia was really kind of at the height of its power. They had won so many victories at such long odds, it was almost, they felt like they were invincible. And Robert E. Lee decided to once again try and take the Army north and take the war to the Federals, try and get the Union armies out of Virginia. So this move was going to culminate in the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Lee's 75,000 men were going to engage about 88,000 Federals from the Army of the Potomac, now commanded by George Gordon Meade. On July 1st, the rebels routed the Yankees north and west of Gettysburg, pushing them through the town to the heights beyond. The Mississippi Brigade of Brigadier General Joseph Davis, who is shown in the upper left-hand corner here, fought at the railroad cut. And this image shown here is a post-war photograph taken probably late 1800s, early 1900s of the railroad cut where Davis's brigade fought. And one of the regiments that fought in the railroad cut with Davis's brigade was the Second Mississippi Infantry. And they lost their flag to the 6th Wisconsin Infantry in very bitter fighting. In 1893, William B. Murphy, and this is a post-war picture of Murphy in the bottom right-hand corner, wrote an account of how he lost the regiment's flag. And he said in his account, quote, "You will remember that I am the only one that ever gave up the colors of the old Second to a Yankee. And that was on the memorable day, July 1st, in the railroad cut at Gettysburg, after a bloody and hand-to-hand fight. They got my flag, but they paid very dearly for all the honor they received at the hands of our men, who killed some 4 or 5 of the Yankees after Colonel Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin and Major John A. Blair had given orders to surrender and cease firing. Those days still hold a deep impression in my mind, as if it had occurred yesterday, though it has been 29 years since the Battle of Gettysburg. This account was published in the Weekly Clarion Ledger from Jackson, Mississippi, July 27, 1893. On the second day's fighting at Gettysburg, Lee attacked both flanks of the Union Army. His troops came very close to breaking the Federal line, and in the fighting that day, Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade smashed the Union forces defending the peach orchard and kept advancing in the face of very heavy fire. General Barksdale, shown in this illustration here, was mortally wounded in the fighting, and the strength of the Union fire combined with Union reinforcements eventually forced the Mississippians back. But they were, before they were forced back, able to advance further than any other troops on their part of the field. Among the casualties in the fighting that day, there were about 1,500 men in the Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade at the beginning of the attack. About 569 of them were killed in the peach orchard fighting. Among the casualties was Captain Isaac Davis Stamps of the 21st Mississippi Infantry, the nephew of Jefferson Davis, and Private Edward M. Burris of the 21st Mississippi Infantry said of the initial assault at the peach orchard, quote, "We climbed over a fence which intervened and then dashed on toward the Yankee line, which was about 400 yards distant, with the real Confederate yell and in the teeth of a shower of missiles which it is perfectly impossible to describe. To give some idea, I suppose the brigade must have lost at least 400 men in the first 400 yards of the charge. The Yankees stood their ground quite manfully until we were within 50 or 75 yards of them, when they broke into inextricable confusion, and away they went, with the boys right behind them and making them drop at every step, actually strewing the ground with their dead and wounded." Yeah, the Barksdale's Brigade's charge, if there was one moment in the war I could see, I would really love to be able to be a witness to that charge. One observer described it as the most magnificent charge of the war. They literally ran over a brigade of Federals defending the peach orchard, captured numerous flags, numerous Union officers, battery of artillery. They really made an impressive showing that day. Their attack was not successful, but it was sure made with a lot of bravery. So on the third day of the battle, Lee decided to make a massive assault on the Union center. And shown in this main picture is the clump of trees, which was kind of the focal point of the Confederate attack, which came to be known as Pickett's Charge. And this is a post-war picture taken probably in the 1880s. But about 3 p.m., approximately 12,500 Confederates stepped off and marched toward the Union center. The Confederate line was shredded by Union artillery, and then as they grew closer, by musket fire. A few very brave, very determined men were able to penetrate the Union center, but they were very quickly driven back or captured or killed. In the charge, Joseph Davis's Mississippi Brigade, consisting of the 2nd Mississippi, the 11th Mississippi, the 42nd Mississippi, and the 55th North Carolina, were especially hard hit and suffered numerous casualties. Shown in the inset picture here is the modern monument to the 11th Mississippi Infantry. And one of the Mississippians killed in Pickett's charge was Corporal Jeremiah Gage of the 11th Mississippi. Mortally wounded by a shell while waiting for the charge to start, Gage had enough strength left to write a letter to his mother, one final letter, and he told her, quote, "This is the last you may ever hear from me. I have time to tell you that I died like a man. Bear my loss as best you can. Remember that I am true to my country, and my greatest regret at dying is that she is not free, and you and my sister are robbed of my worth, whatever that may be. This letter is stained with my blood." Well, Pickett's charge was repulsed. On July 4th, 1863, General Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg. The loss of this battle, combined with the loss of Vicksburg on the same day, really marked kind of one of the great turning points of the war. Rebel casualties at Gettysburg were about 3,900 men killed, 18,700 wounded, and about over 5,400 missing. The battle cost the 11 Mississippi infantry regiments engaged at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,300 killed or wounded. It was a very bloody day for Mississippi. And for weeks thereafter, the Mississippi newspaper would be filled with accounts of the battle and casualty lists of the Mississippi regiments that fought at Gettysburg. And this brings to an end part 2 of Mississippians in the Army of Northern Virginia. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. I'll try to answer them as best I can. Please stay tuned for part 3, which will be the concluding episode in this trilogy on the Army of Northern Virginia. I hope to have that posted in the next week or so. And thank you again, and thanks for watching.